Howdy folks, and welcome to a sneak preview of the British battleships appearing sometime soon in World of Warships. Not sure exactly when. I've had some replays sent in by Jerome Ty. That's him and his Charles Martel, the French Tier 8 cruiser, not a British battleship. But he has had the good fortune to run into the British Tier 7, 8, 9 and 10 battleships while playing World of Warships on the North American server. Well, at least I'm assuming it's a North American server because he keeps running into a very kawaii Canadian at several points throughout the course of these battles. You'll know him when you see him. More on that later. For now, we're going to be taking a look at, well, this was actually the first surprise because when the British battleships were announced, HMS Nelson, the Nelson class battleship, did not have a battle tier assigned to it. And the King George V was nominated as the Tier 7. But we can see pretty clearly here that the Nelson is in fact the Tier 7. So where does that leave the King George V? Well, it's actually at Tier 8. Wait, hang on a minute. The Nelson is at Tier 7 with 9 16-inch guns. And King George V is at Tier 8 with 10 14-inch guns. Oh, this is going to be good. Well, don't get too carried away just yet. Wait until we take a look at the King George V. For now, however, it's the Nelson. And there she is. Her Majesty's ship Nelson, one of two Nelson-class battleships, the other one being HMS Rodney, which famously took part in the destruction of the Bismarck. So, what can we tell just from looking at this ship? Well, I'm not seeing any guns dotting the side of the hull from barbettes, which means this is definitely not the 1927 configuration and is more likely to be the late World War II, possibly 1945 configuration. Let's take a look at the guns. Nelson was armed with 9 16-inch guns, 3 guns per turret, all 3 turrets mounted forward of the superstructure, a very unusual configuration mimicked by the Japanese Tier 9 Izumo. On the rearmost turret you can see a catapult, that's for launching a seaplane. Now I don't know if that's going to be a catapult fighter or a spotter aircraft, but it should have one or the other, or possibly a choice between two. They've also gone and modelled the derrick. Let me just focus the camera on it, the crane, in that nest of 20mm anti-aircraft guns which would be used to recover the seaplane after it had been launched. Speaking of anti-aircraft guns, I'm seeing lots and lots and lots of short-range 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns. And that turret there is a 4.7-inch or 120mm anti-aircraft gun which may also comprise part of the secondary battery. You can see the main secondary guns here. These are 6-inch guns. It's got 12 of them, 6 on each side. And these are not apparently dual-purpose weapons, so they do not form part of the ship's anti-aircraft defences. You can see a heck of a lot more anti-aircraft guns. These are the old 40mm pom-poms. Again, these are medium-range weapons, and the Nelson does have a lot of them. One thing I'm not seeing is any evidence of the old unrotated projectile rocket launchers. Now, Nelson was equipped with them, but they were removed in 1942 when everybody realised that they were completely useless, which would suggest that this is the 1945 configuration of HMS Nelson. I'm also seeing no evidence of the torpedo launchers. This ship was equipped with torpedoes, not a particularly strong torpedo arm. It had one tube on each side and could carry 12 torpedoes in total, but it did at least have them. In fact, her sister ship, the Rodney, actually torpedoed the Bismarck. It's the only battleship in history to ever score a torpedo hit on another battleship. The problem with the Nelsons were that they were designed under the limitations of the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which meant that they had to be limited to a tonnage of 35,000 tons, and in order to meet that tonnage limitation, certain sacrifices had to be made, most notably propulsion and armour. This was a slow ship. At best she could manage a top speed of 23.5 knots. And while her armour was certainly adequate, with anything between 330 and 356mm of belt armour, it was only really the vital areas of the ship that had this level of protection: magazines and the engine spacers. This of course was in order to meet the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty and meet that 35,000 ton maximum weight limit. One interesting statistic about the ship is that it did have very, very strong deck armour, up to 171mm, and it'll be a cold day in hell before we see that kind of deck armour thickness on any Tier 7 battleship in World of Warships. So what we appear to have here is a Tier 7 British battleship that is kind of slow and can't retreat while firing unless it's sailing backwards, in which case it's going to be even slower. It's going to be kind of vulnerable to high explosive and fires thanks to that all or nothing armour protection. Just looking at the model of the ship and counting up the number and type of anti-aircraft guns, you would expect its anti-aircraft firepower to be at least decent. But I've heard that it's not actually very good. And while it definitely has more 16-inch guns than any other Tier 7 battleship, the Colorado only has 8, the Nagato only has 8, the Gneisenau only has 6, and they're only 15, not 16-inch guns. But I'm also hearing rumours that the shell weight, and therefore the damage, is inferior to the other 16-inch gun-armed Tier 7 battleships, and the penetration is also on the low side too. So, bit of a mixed bag, I think, with HMS Nelson. And that brings us on to Tier 8, and the King George V, which is, I have to admit, quite a surprising choice for a Tier 8 ship, because the King George V was only armed with 14-inch guns, and was originally slated to be appearing in the game in the position that the Nelson occupies, at Tier 7. So what's going on with the King George V? You see, I think what a lot of people were thinking was that at Tier 6 we were going to have the Nelson, and yeah, I realise it does sound outrageous to have a Tier 6 battleship armed with 16-inch guns, but there is a precedent for it. The Japanese Tier 6 Premium, the Mutsu, does have 16-inch guns. So given the Nelson's slow speed and comparable armour to the Mutsu, with a 1927 configuration without all of those additional 40mm anti-aircraft guns, it's not out of the question to see the Nelson as a Tier 6 battleship, which meant that we would have King George V at Tier 7, as advertised, armed with 10 14-inch guns, which is still a little on the weak side for a Tier 7 battleship. But the idea that this ship is a Tier 8 battleship, and it still only has 14-inch guns? Well, we'll come on to that in a moment, but let's just take a look at the ship. See the two forward gun turrets there, very unusual configuration for the turrets, but ahead of the number 1 turret there with its 4 14-inch guns, you can see there's a forest of 20mm anti-aircraft guns. And this is fairly standard. 20mm Oerlikons were used in huge numbers for close-range air defence. You can see that the central superstructure of the ship is just covered in more 20 and 40mm anti-aircraft guns. And these secondaries here, these are 134mm guns, and they are also anti-aircraft guns as well. What I'm not seeing is any facility to launch and recover aircraft, however. You can see cranes there, midships, but those are for launching and recovering the sea boats. Lots and lots and lots of anti-aircraft guns, however. And when we eventually get to take a look at the quarterdeck of the ship, right at the back end, the arse end in Royal Naval terminology, as opposed to the pointy end, which is the bit at the front, we're going to see even more anti-aircraft guns. Now, while the ship does have a metric arse ton of 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns, I think there's something like 55 of them, but these are of course just self-defence anti-aircraft guns with a very limited range of just 2 kilometres. As far as its 40mm anti-aircraft firepower is concerned, at first glance it does look a heck of a lot better. This ship has, I think, 96 40mm anti-aircraft barrels pointing skyward. Unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of those are the quick-firing Mark 6 and Mark 7 anti-aircraft guns, the infamous pom-poms, which are nowhere near as capable as the excellent Swedish 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, which were arguably the finest anti-aircraft gun of World War II. It does have some of these. It has 8 of them. That's it. 2 mounts, each with 4 guns. The other 88 40mm anti-aircraft guns on board the King George V are all the quick-firing Mark 6 and Mark 7s. Still, what it lacks in effectiveness, it makes up for in volume. That is still an awful lot of 40mm barrels pointing in the direction of anything that approaches you from the air. The ship is pretty well protected though. The citadel appears to be almost all below the waterline and has anything between 260 and I think 280mm of citadel armour with a 381mm armour belt. She's also faster than the Nelson with a maximum speed of 28 knots. But it's the main battery firepower that worries me about this ship. Alright, it has 10 guns. That's a lot of guns, but they're still just 14-inch guns. The Amagi has 10 guns. That's also a Tier 8 battleship, and they're 16-inch guns. The North Carolina only has 1 gun less, and they're 16-inch guns. The Bismarck has 2 guns less, but they're 15-inch guns. They're still a larger caliber, and that means a heavier weight of firepower and heavier alpha damage for each shell that hits. Now bear in mind that everything that I'm telling you about the King George V is based on data mined stats from the Super Test server that's subject to change and is guaranteed to change before any of these ships, not just the King George V, but any of the British battleships appear in this video. It's all a work in progress, it's all subject to change, but the point does remain that the low caliber of the King George V's guns is going to be a significant problem, and not just because it has the shortest ranged guns of any Tier 8 battleship, and not just because those 14-inch shells, even though it is firing 10 of them with every salvo, have a lower weight of firepower than a ship with 15 or 16-inch guns, even if they have less of those guns, but because they're 14-inch, what that means is that the King George V is the only battleship in the game that cannot penetrate the bows of battleships lower tier than itself with its main battery guns. You just can't do it. It can't overmatch lower tier battleship bow or stern armour with 14-inch guns. That's just the way the overmatch mechanics work. Now, once again, bearing in mind, none of what I'm about to tell you is confirmed in any way, shape or form, but I have heard that there is going to be a hull upgrade, and we're delving deep into the realms of fantasy here, but there is going to be a hull upgrade for the King George V which will allow you to swap out those 14-inch gun turrets for 15-inch gun turrets. And that, if true, would put the King George V on, well, at least an equal footing and possibly a superior footing to the Bismarck. And I don't think anybody would be prepared to stand up with a straight face and say the Bismarck was a weak Tier 8 battleship. So, I'm afraid I don't know an awful lot more about the King George V, but even if that speculation is true, one thing we can guarantee about the King George V is that with 14-inch guns stock as a Tier 8 battleship, this is going to be one bitch of a ship to grind. Frankly, you know, I'm not even really sure why the King George V is at Tier 8 anyway. It would just make more sense to me, at least, to have the 1927 version of the Nelson at Tier 6, the King George V at Tier 7, and at Tier 8, HMS Vanguard, the Royal Navy's fastest and most powerful battleship, and the last battleship to be launched in the world. So, the Vanguard's at Tier 9 then? No. The Vanguard isn't in the game. What we have instead at Tier 9 are the Lion class battleships. The Lions were the Royal Navy's design for fast battleships that were laid down in the 1930s. Although they were never completed, they were essentially going to be bigger, better versions of the King George V, armed with the 16-inch guns, not the 14-inch guns that Churchill wanted the King George V class of ships to be armed with anyway. Now, the Lion comes by default with 9 16-inch guns, although it can upgrade to 16.5-inch guns. Furthermore, the high explosive shells fired by these 16 or 16.5-inch guns get the same quarter caliber penetration value as the Germans, and this is why German battleship high explosive is so good. Everybody else gets a 6th caliber penetration value with a high explosive shell, so the Lion gets that also. The armour-piercing shells fired by the Lion have a relatively short fuse, which means that they can have problems dealing with the belt armour of other battleships at anything other than medium and short ranges. But if that's causing you problems in the Lion, then just load your German equivalent high explosive and pepper them with that until you get close enough to make the armour-piercing count. But that short fuse on the armour-piercing shell means that cruisers that become the focus of the Lion's main caliber guns are unlikely to suffer many overpenetrations. The Lion's guns are likely to do full damage to cruisers without overpenetrating. Now, do bear in mind that these stats are obviously going to be subject to change. She doesn't have a huge amount of health. It is kind of on the low side with only 67,900. Her anti-aircraft firepower, however, is very respectable. There are no 20mm anti-aircraft guns on this ship. The dedicated anti-aircraft guns are all 40mm Bofors, and they have a range of 3.5 kilometers. Her secondaries, and she has 16 of them, are all 134mm guns, and they have a 5km surface range and a 4.5km anti-air range. Her 9 16 or 16.5 inch main battery guns have a firing range of 20.7 kilometers. They have a 4 degree per second turret rotation speed and a 30-second reload, and the ship itself has a top speed of 29.5 knots. She really does seem to be a fairly good ship. As far as consumables for these ships are concerned, there have been some videos on YouTube showing radar available in the consumable slots for some of these ships. I can't confirm or deny whether or not that is actually going to be a thing when these ships go live. At the moment, looking at the data mine data for the Lion at least, I can see that in the third consumable slot you have the choice of hydroacoustic search, spotting aircraft or catapult fighter. However, all of these things are of course very much subject to change. And I'll bet all the destroyer captains out there are begging, please no. No more ships with radar. The cruisers are bad enough, but now the battleships are getting it too. No, make it stop. Yeah, I feel your pain. So, yeah, the Lion does look pretty good. Although, you know, good ship or not, I don't think he's, he's not going to live much longer driving out in front of that lot. I think if I was him, I would have taken my chances with the torpedoes. Everybody wants to kill the new ship, but, well, you know, who wouldn't shoot at a target like that? At that kind of range, just wow. Yep, he's gone. He's done. Well, never mind. We're just going to take a quick break from gawping at the British battleships because I really do feel like I owe him this. This is Jerome, the guy that sent the replays in the first place, and he's about to have his 15 minutes of fame on YouTube because that over there in the Neptune, that's Arlios. What do you mean, who's Arlios? He's our very own tame YouTube Canadian. He does fantastic World of Warships videos, and he's in this battle. And Jerome here has just sunk him. But Jerome, no time to celebrate. Arlios may be down, but that doesn't mean he can't kill you. He's very good at what he does. Oh, he's dodged one set of torpedoes. No, took that one on the bows. That's guaranteed flooding, and oh dear, Jerome's damage control appears to be on cooldown. Oh well, never mind. But hold on, what's that off in the distance? Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the British Tier 10 battleship, Her Majesty's ship Conqueror. Now at the moment, take the stats of this ship with a very, very liberal dose of salt, because they're just all over the place at the minute. She has low health for a Tier 10 battleship, only 82,900 health. Her protection is also not great. The Citadel sits fairly high above the water, and I think the Citadel armour itself is something like 254mm, although it is also covered by an armour belt that I think is anything up to 416mm thick. But the armour everywhere else is basically non-existent. At the moment, this ship is a torch that's just begging to be set on fire by large caliber high explosive shells. That's the bad news. The good news, and again, subject to change, is the firepower. This ship has 8 457mm guns. These are 18-inch guns. They're second only to the Yamato. However, whereas the Yamato has 18.1-inch guns, they are 460mm guns, and the Conqueror has 457mm guns. That 3mm of caliber does make a very, very big difference. Because the Yamato, with its armour piercing, can still overmatch the bow and stern armour of every other battleship in the game. And the Conqueror cannot do that. So, armour angling is going to be effective if you're in another battleship of a equivalent or lower tier. Armour angling is still going to help you against the Conqueror's armour piercing. Not so much against the Yamato. Although the Yamato does still need to strike you on the bows of the ship, so accuracy is going to be a factor in order to over-penetrate your bows and possibly citadel you from the front. The Conqueror is not going to be able to do that. But its 457mm high explosive, like the Lion before it at tier 9, gets the same quarter caliber penetration value for its high explosive shells as the Germans. Which means, since Conqueror has 457mm guns, its high explosive shells can penetrate, and they're never going to ricochet, from anything up to 114mm of armour. Now the Conqueror's just gone unspotted for the moment. Whoever launched those torpedoes is inside the smokescreen and not spotting him, but... well, 2 of those torpedoes hit something, and only 1 of them was the Conqueror, so there's something else out there, and there are more torpedoes on the way. Now the Conqueror here just took a torpedo hit to the bow, so that will have caused flooding, so he will have used his damage control. So, well, he's not flooding anymore, but he's coming under a heck of a lot of fire here, from both armour piercing and high explosive shells, and you can see the way his health is just slowly melting away. And he's probably going to take a lot more damage here, because he's going to have to turn and give his broadside to that grosser Kurfürst over there, in order to get out of the way of all the ships shooting at him. So he's about to lose a lot of health. Now, this is something else that seems to be quite special about the Conqueror. We're just going to wait and see how much damage he does actually take here. More hits. He's not taking a huge amount. There's the Kurfürst. Yeah. No citadels. He hasn't taken a single citadel from any of the ships shooting at him. The citadel of this ship is well protected, it's just everything else on the ship that has no armour. Ooh, he is taking a ferocious beating here. But have a look, and he's on fire. Right, so he's not going to be able to do anything about that fire because his damage control's on cooldown from controlling the flooding from the initial torpedo hit. And look how much health he has remaining. He's got around 20,000 health remaining. He's still coming under fire and he's still burning, but he's managed to get this island between himself and the majority of his tormentors. He's down to around 15,000 health now. And for the moment he thinks he's moderately safe as he comes around the side of the island, but there's bad news waiting for him on the other side of the island. There's a Montana, a Tirpitz and a Zau over there. And his health is dropping even further. Surely he's doomed. Well, you'd think so. But just wait until he pops his heel. He's going to be down to around about 9,000 health when he uses it, and then watch his health bar. Any second now. There it goes. And watch the health bar start to fill up. This is nothing short of utterly ridiculous. He's under fire from multiple ships, and his health bar is going up. That's the Conqueror's heel. At the moment, subject to change, the Conqueror, by the way, is also the one British battleship that is confirmed to get surveillance radar as a consumable in the 3rd consumable slot. The 457mm guns have a range of 29.2 kilometers, and the ship has a speed of 29.5 knots. However, I am informed that the latest changes on the Super Test server have removed the 457mm guns, and instead it's being given 12 419mm guns, or in other words, it's now HMS Montana. I think we can safely say that Wargaming are exercising their options as far as HMS Conqueror is concerned. They really don't know what they want this ship to be at the moment, and they're just messing around. And as such, anything that you've seen about the Conqueror, whether that's on a blog, whether that's on YouTube, including this video, just disregard it. Because the ship that eventually emerges on the live server is likely to have very, very little to do with anything that you may have seen or anything you may have read about. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this sneak peek, at long last, at the British battleships in World of Warships, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.